The trip started as an impulsive decision, one born out of a collective need to escape the weight of our lives for a few days. The air in the city felt increasingly suffocating, overwhelmed by the noise, the schedules, and the endless deadlines, and so a weekend in the wilderness seemed like the perfect antidote. We were a group of 4: Alex, Sarah, Mia, and myself. We had been friends for years, but this was the first time in a while that we had all managed to coordinate a trip together. The thought of reconnecting in nature, away from the world, felt liberating. None of us were expert hikers, and none of us cared much for a structured itinerary. Our goal was simple: get away, breathe fresh air, and let the forest work its magic. We didn't pick a specific location, just a vague area on a map that looked untouched, wild, far from the beaten paths where crowds of people wandered. The idea of being isolated in the woods, with only our tents and each other for company, was comforting in a way that was hard to explain. The drive up to the forest was long but serene. We passed by sleepy towns, the road winding through sprawling fields and dense patches of trees. The deeper we drove, the more the world outside felt like a distant memory. I could feel the tension of the city slip away bit by bit. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon, and the sun had already started its slow descent toward the horizon. The air was cool but not yet cold, a perfect temperature for hiking. We gathered our gear, unloaded the backpacks, and began our trek into the woods. The path was rugged but manageable, winding through thick undergrowth, tall trees, and the occasional creek. We didn't speak much as we walked. The crunch of boots against the dirt trail was the only sound that accompanied us. The forest was dense here, the canopy above blocking out much of the light, and the world seemed to fall into a hushed silence that felt both eerie and peaceful at the same time. By the time we found a suitable campsite near a small clearing, the sky was already turning dark, the last remnants of daylight fading quickly. We set up our tents in a loose semicircle, the fire pit at the center. The forest was quiet now, except for the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. It was a strange, almost unnatural stillness, but it didn't bother me. In fact, it felt oddly comforting, like we were the only ones alive in a world that had forgotten time. Alex and Mia started gathering firewood, while Sarah and I worked on the tent. The process was slow, but with a group of people, everything seemed easier. It didn't take long for the fire to come to life, flickering orange and yellow against the deepening blue of the night sky. We all settled around the campfire once the tents were pitched, the warmth from the flames fighting off the chill of the evening air. There was an intoxicating simplicity to it, the crackling fire, the fresh pine scent of the forest, the steady rhythm of nightfall. As the night stretched on, we sat around the fire and talked. We didn't talk about anything important. There were no deep philosophical debates or moments of self-reflection. It was just the typical banter of old friends, our voices echoing into the open, the sound mixing with the natural noises of the forest, the calls of distant owls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, and the breeze that stirred the branches above. We passed around a bottle of whiskey, laughing and trading stories, the warmth of alcohol easing the tension that had built up over the past few weeks of our lives. Mia, who had always been the storyteller of the group, began spinning an old ghost story she'd heard when she was younger. She spoke in a low, almost theatrical voice, embellishing the details with exaggerated gestures. Her audience, Sarah and Alex, listened raptly, hanging on every word, but I felt my eyes wander toward the forest. The trees seemed darker than before, as if the shadows between them had deepened, stretching further into the night. I tried to shake the feeling, but it wouldn't go away. There was something almost suffocating about the vast emptiness around us, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. When Mia finished her story, we all fell into an uncomfortable silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that lingers after a joke dies, or when you're unsure of what to say next. This was different, heavy, thick, and full of unspoken thoughts. I caught myself glancing around, my eyes scanning the edges of the clearing. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches reaching upward, their trunks too still, too unmoving. It was as though the entire forest was waiting for something, waiting for the moment when we would no longer feel like guests, but intruders. Alex, sensing the shift in the air, broke the silence with a nervous laugh. All right. Let's not get all spooky out here, he said, clearly trying to lighten the mood. This is supposed to be a fun trip, right? I nodded, but I couldn't shake the discomfort gnawing at my insides. I had always enjoyed camping, loved being in nature, but tonight felt different. It was hard to put my finger on it. It wasn't just the darkness of the woods or the isolation. It was something else, something deeper. Maybe it was the fact that we were so far from civilization, so removed from the world we knew. Out here, we were vulnerable, exposed. We finished our drinks, stoked the fire a bit more, and began to settle in for the night. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and we all retreated into our tents to get some sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the mesh of the tent roof, the outline of tree branches moving slowly in the breeze above. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, but something kept nagging at me. The forest was too quiet, too still. The sounds of the night had shifted from the peaceful chirping of insects and distant birds to a thick silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the distance. I rolled over my sleeping bag, tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just the wind, the normal noises of the forest. But there was something in the silence, a tension that pulled at me, like a presence lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. I turned my head toward Alex's tent, barely visible in the dark, and wondered if he felt it too. A sound broke the stillness, a faint rustling outside the tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. It was too soft to be the wind. The sound was deliberate, too slow to be an animal. My heart rate picked up, the unease growing as I listened more closely. The noise was steady, moving along the edge of the campsite. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my hand instinctively reaching for the zipper, but I stopped myself. Was it just the wind? Or had something or someone just walked past our camp? I waited in the dark, my pulse thundering in my ears. The rustling outside stopped, and for a moment there was nothing. The world felt frozen, every sound muted. Then, just as I was beginning to convince myself it was nothing, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. The footsteps, or whatever they were, moved with purpose, too slow, too careful. There was no mistaking it now. Someone or something was moving around our campsite. I wasn't sure what to do. My breath caught in my throat. Should I wake Alex? Should I tell the others? My mind raced, but before I could make a decision, the sound stopped again, just as abruptly as it had begun. I waited. Nothing. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself that it was just the wind, just an animal. I forced myself to breathe deeply, hoping the feeling would pass. But then came the final sound, the one that I couldn't deny. It was so soft I almost didn't catch it first, but it was there. A slow, deliberate breath, drawn just outside the tent, as if someone or something was standing there, waiting. I froze. The sound came again, a shallow, almost imperceptible breath. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to speak. My mind screamed, but my body didn't obey. And then, in the silence that followed, the whisper of something against the fabric of the tent. A soft, hesitant touch, like a face pressed against it. The fabric bulged inward just slightly, a faint indentation forming where the pressure was. I held my breath. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the tent fabric, my heart racing in my chest. The breath outside the tent had stopped, but the dread hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown, filling the space around me like a heavy fog that clung to my every thought. I listened to the forest, trying to convince myself that it was nothing more than the wind, a raccoon, or perhaps the trees brushing against each other. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deeply wrong. I slowly reached for the zipper of my sleeping bag, my fingers trembling. I had to know what was out there. I had to see if it was just my imagination or something far worse. But before I could move, I heard it again, the faintest rustle, too deliberate to be an animal. It came from right outside my tent. A footstep, a pause, then another. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. It was as if whatever it was knew exactly where I was, knew I was awake, and it was waiting for me to react. I pressed my face into the cool fabric of the tent, trying to quiet my breathing, trying to stay as still as possible, hoping that whatever it was would lose interest. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the camp, slow, methodical steps, almost as if someone was pacing. I could hear the crunch of dry leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, and the occasional creak of branches as the unseen figure shifted its weight. Each step was louder, closer, until it felt like it was right on top of me. My heart hammered against my rib cage, and I could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. It was impossible to ignore the presence now. Whoever or whatever was out there was deliberately trying to make itself known. The air in the tent grew colder, and I pulled my blanket up tighter around me, as if it could protect me from whatever was lurking just outside the walls. I couldn't bring myself to look outside. The idea of facing whatever was out there, seeing it with my own eyes, was too much. I knew, deep down, that if I saw it, I would never be the same again. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just a person, a late-night wanderer who had gotten lost. Maybe they were just as scared as I was, wandering the woods in the dark. But that thought only made my skin crawl more. Why would anyone be out here in the middle of the night, alone and wandering? I waited for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing against me. But then, just as I thought it might be safe to relax, I heard the worst sound yet, a whisper. It was barely audible, a soft murmur that I almost didn't catch. But when I did, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The whisper wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It wasn't a word I could understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was an invitation, a beckoning. and it was coming from the darkness beyond the tent. The whisper came again, followed by a slow scrape, something rough, something dragging against the forest floor. My heart skipped a beat. I was paralyzed, every muscle in my body locked in place, too terrified to move. The scrape continued, moving along the side of the tent, circling me. Each drag was like the claws of a beast, scratching against the thin fabric, threatening to tear through it at any moment. I could hear the movement outside, could hear it growing nearer, closer, until it was right against the edge of my tent. I could feel its presence. It was too close now, so close I could almost hear its breath. But there was no sound of footsteps, no shifting of weight, no rustling leaves. Only that dragging sound, as if something was slowly, methodically moving around me. The scrape stopped. Absolute silence followed. I held my breath, not daring to move. The stillness was suffocating. Time seemed to stretch, pulling me into its endless embrace. It felt like hours passed before I finally gathered the courage to move, to make a sound. My hand shook as I reached for the zipper of my tent. I was torn. Part of me wanted to know what was outside, but the other part of me screamed to stay hidden, to stay safe. I slowly unzipped the tent, my mind racing with what I might see. My heart pounded in my chest as I peered outside, hoping, no, praying, that it was just my imagination, just a trick of the mind. But there was nothing. The campsite was empty. The fire still flickered in the distance, casting long, eerie shadows across the clearing. The other tents stood silent in the night. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, but the relief didn't last long. I turned my gaze to the edges of the clearing, to the dark shapes of the trees that surrounded us. That's when I saw it. There in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the firelight, was a figure. It was impossible to make out any details at first. The figure was standing still, too still, barely moving in the shadows. It was tall, taller than any of us, and its shape was all wrong. The silhouette was vaguely human, but it was distorted. The limbs were too long, the posture too unnatural. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like it didn't quite belong to this world. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even though every part of me screamed to look away, to hide. The figure didn't move, not at first. It just stood there watching. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold, empty, like it was peering into my very soul. It was waiting for something, waiting for me to react. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to explain what I was seeing. My mind was racing, my thoughts a blur, but one thing was clear. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't seeing things. There was something out there, something real. The figure stepped forward. I immediately ducked back into the tent, my breath ragged, my body trembling. The weight of the world felt like it had come crashing down on me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think. All I could do was wait. The footsteps returned. The same slow, deliberate steps, only now they were closer. So close that I could hear them clearly, loud, echoing, and unmistakable. The figure was circling my tent now, its presence pressing against me from all sides. I could feel the weight of it, the oppressive sense that something was wrong, that I was being watched, hunted. I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. We were in the middle of nowhere. I cursed under my breath, the feeling of isolation growing stronger. I was completely alone in this. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A soft tapping, like fingernails against the fabric of the tent. It was gentle at first, almost playful, but the longer it continued, the more frantic it became. The tapping grew louder, sharper. It was as if whatever was wanting to get inside. I backed away from the tent wall, my heart in my throat. The tapping stopped abruptly. A moment of eerie silence followed, and then a voice, faint at first, like a whisper, but clear enough to hear, "Let me in." I could still hear the voice, faint but unmistakable. "Let me in." The words echoed in my mind, like a haunting melody that refused to fade. They weren't directed at anyone in particular, but they felt personal, directed at me. I pressed my hand against my ears, trying to block it out, try to convince myself that it wasn't real, that I was just imagining things. But the tap, tap, tap continued, persistent, like fingernails scraping the fabric of my tent, each tap growing louder and more frantic. It wasn't just one set of nails. It was multiple. The sound of tiny, irregular taps overlapped, as though something was pressing its many hands, against the walls of the tent. I tried to steady my breathing, fighting the panic rising in my chest. My mind was a swirl of thoughts, all of them racing, but none of them making sense. What did it want? Why was it doing this? Who or what was outside my tent? The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the trees like a chorus of tortured voices. The tent buckled under the force of it, the thin walls groaning and shuddering. I had to remind myself to breathe. In, out, in, out. But even the rhythm of my own breathing seemed alien in the stillness that followed the wind. It was like time had stopped. The tapping stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. It felt as though the forest around me had drawn in a collective breath, holding it, waiting for something. I waited too, but I knew, deep down, that whatever it was wasn't gone. It was still there, still watching. My eyes flicked to the zipper of the tent. My hand twitched with the overwhelming need to open it, to see what was outside. But I fought the urge. I couldn't. Not yet. If I opened it, I would be exposing myself. I would be letting it in. Then, through the silence, came another sound, a low, rumbling growl. The growl wasn't animal. It wasn't human either. It was guttural, almost like the earth itself was shaking, a deep vibration that rumbled through the air, rattling my bones. It came from far beyond the trees, deep within the forest, but it felt so close, as if the growl was happening inside my head. I clutched my knees to my chest, the cold creeping into my skin, spreading through my bones. Every instinct I had told me to get up, to run. But where would I go? The forest stretched out for miles in every direction, endless and dark. There was no escape, and I knew that. I knew the moment I stepped outside the tent, it would be there waiting for me. I couldn't stay in here forever. Eventually, I would have to face it. I reached for my phone again, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I would get a signal. But the screen remained blank, no service. My fingers slipped from the screen as I dropped it into the dirt beside me. There was no way to reach anyone, no way to call for help. I was alone, completely and utterly alone. The growling faded, replaced by something else. Something worse. A whispering, soft and insidious, like the rustling of dead leaves, only it came from inside the tent. It didn't sound like it was from outside. It was right next to me. I could feel the words in my ears, too close to ignore, too real to be imagined. Let me in. It was the same voice from before. The voice that had spoken through the tent walls, clear, and chilling. The voice that seemed to know exactly what to say to make my blood run cold. My breath caught in my throat. The whisper wasn't just a request anymore. It was an imperative, a demand. The shadows outside the tent shifted, moving with unnatural fluidity. My pulse quickened as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure, whatever it was still there, lingering just out of sight, but I could feel it. I could feel its presence, pressing against the fabric like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to give in. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear that had been mounting within me, building with each passing second, finally broke through. I grabbed the zipper and yanked it open, my heart pounding in my chest as I braced myself for whatever would happen next. The night air hit me like a cold slap, the chill biting into my skin. I squinted into the darkness, eyes darting from tree to tree, trying to make out any movement. But the forest was silent now. The growl had faded. The whispering had stopped. But I knew better than to believe the silence. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling as I stepped outside the tent. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the damp soil sticking to the soles. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next, looking for movement, for any sign that something or someone was lurking nearby. Nothing. But then I saw it. The footprints. They weren't there when I went to sleep. I was sure of it. The ground had been smooth, untouched. But now there they were. Footprints. Barefoot prints, leading from the edge of my tent, cutting through the grass, and trailing off into the dark forest beyond. I froze. The footprints didn't belong to anyone in our group. I recognized every pair of boots and shoes that had been around the campfire. These weren't human footprints. They were too large, too irregular, and the toes were elongated, the steps uneven like someone or something was dragging its foot. My breath hitched as I looked down at the prints. The ground around them was damp, like something had been dragged across it. A low, rattling breath caught in my throat as I took a step back. The air was thick with the smell of earth, wet and decayed, like something was rotting just beneath the surface. I didn't want to follow the tracks, but something inside me, something primal, something desperate, urged me forward. It was like I was being pulled into the forest, guided by the footprints as they twisted and turned through the undergrowth. I took one step, then another, and another. The deeper I went into the forest, the darker it became. The trees grew thicker, their branches interlocking like fingers, blocking out the faint light from the moon. My surroundings felt suffocating, like the forest was closing in on me, pressing in from all sides. The footprints led me deeper still, further away from the campsite, until I could no longer hear the crackling of the fire. The only sound now was the soft whisper of the wind, carrying something faint and far off. A voice, a whisper. It was saying my name. Come closer. I stopped dead in my tracks. My blood ran cold, my heart thumping in my chest. I wasn't alone. I turned around to head back, but the way was no longer clear. The trees were different now. The shapes were distorted. The path was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A face. It was pressed against the bark of a tree, pale and contorted, eyes wide and unblinking. The lips barely moved as they whispered, "Let me in." I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, constricted by an unseen hand. The face, that grotesque, pale face pressed against the tree, was still there, watching me. Its eyes were wide open, unblinking, as if they could see into the depths of my soul. I could feel its gaze burning into me, even though I'd turn away. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place, a prisoner of the terror that gripped me. The whispering voice from earlier, the one that had been calling to me, let me in, returned, only now it was closer. I could hear it in my ear, just above a breath, as though it was standing right next to me, leaning in to speak directly into my soul. You're so close. The words slid under my skin, like ice water dripping into my veins. My heart began to race, hammering in my chest, but still my body didn't respond. The whisper continued, its tone soft but insistent. Come closer. Just a little more. I need you. I had to get out of here. I had to leave before whatever this thing was, this thing that had been stalking me, took me. I turned on my heel, desperate to escape. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled through the underbrush, branches clawing at my arms, the ground uneven beneath my feet. The air had thickened, pressing down on me like a weight. Every step felt heavier, as though the forest itself was fighting me, holding me back. The trees seemed to grow taller, darker, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The further I went, the more the landscape around me seemed to shift, bending, warping, until I couldn't recognize the forest anymore. It wasn't the same place I had walked into earlier. It felt alien, suffocating. The familiar had become strange, and the strange had become terrifying. I looked behind me, expecting to see the footprints, those horrifying, unnatural prints that had led me into this nightmare. But they were gone. The ground was empty, undisturbed, as if I had never followed them in the first place. The wind picked up again, whispering through the trees, and I swore I heard the faintest echo of my name. Come closer. I froze. The voice wasn't just in my ear now. It was in the air, surrounding me, pressing in from all directions. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, in my bones, like something was physically tugging at me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I stumbled forward, my body moving against my will. It was as though my legs had become disconnected from my mind, as though I was no longer in control. I tried to fight it, tried to stop, but it was no use. My feet carried me further, deeper into the forest, and the voice continued to call me, relentless, soothing in its horror. You're almost there. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but the terror inside me paralyzed me. My mind was spiraling, my thoughts fractured and disjointed, spinning like a tornado. Suddenly, the trees parted. I had no idea how far I'd walked, or if the forest had simply shifted around me. But now I was standing in a clearing. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the moonlight fell like cold silver onto the ground. And in the center of the clearing was the thing. It wasn't fully visible at first, hidden in the shadows, but the faint outline of something. Unnatural, something wrong, began to take shape in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its body was a twisted mockery of a human form, the skin pale and stretched too tight over its bones. Its face, my God, its face was a grotesque mask of featureless skin, smooth and white, except for the black, hollow eyes that seemed to swallow all the light around them. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight, suffocated by the sheer horror of what I was witnessing. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching me, its black eyes fixed on mine. And then it smiled. Not a smile of any human sort, but a grotesque stretching of the skin, a wide, gaping grin that seemed to tear at the corners of its mouth. The smile was wrong, too wide, too stretched, as though it had no limits, no boundaries. "You've come so far," the voice whispered again, this time clearer, louder, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Now you can finally let me in." The figure started to step toward me. The movement was jerky, unnatural, as though its body wasn't quite sure how to move in this world. But despite the grotesque quality of its movement, it was fast. Too fast. I stumbled back, my foot catching on something, a root, a stone, I wasn't sure, and I fell. The ground rushed up to meet me, and for a split second, I felt the cold earth beneath my palms, but then it was gone. The moment I hit the ground, the clearing seemed to collapse in on itself. The trees, the moonlight, the figure, it all disappeared as though it had never been there at all. And then I was alone, or at least I thought I was. A shadow moved in the corner of my eye, and I spun around to face it. But there was nothing there, nothing except the trees and the oppressive darkness. It was as if the thing had never been real. It was as if the whole experience had been a fever dream, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I wasn't alone. The thing was still there. It had followed me back. It had always been with me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I slowly stood, my legs trembling beneath me, and I took a cautious step forward. The forest was quiet again, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I had to get back to camp. I had to find the others. But as I turned to retrace my steps, a voice, this time soft and familiar, whispered my name from the darkness. "Come back." I stopped. I couldn't move. The voice, though quiet, seemed to seep into every corner of my mind, the words wrapping around me like a vice. "Come back. Let me in." I turned toward the sound, and there, at the edge of the trees, I saw it again, the face. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, faster and faster, as the shadow at the edge of the trees inched closer. The voice continued to whisper, as though it was inside my head, inside my very soul. "Come back. Let me in." I tried to run, to move, but my legs were frozen in place. The world around me swirled, the trees warping and twisting as if they were alive, bending in on themselves. The darkness was alive, thick with presence, thick with it. I had to leave, I knew that much. But every step I took felt heavier, like the forest itself was pushing me back, forcing me to face whatever horror had followed me out here. I turned again, and the world blurred for a moment before everything snapped back into focus. And there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the face. It was no longer just a vague shape in the shadows. It was there, clear as day, just like it had been before, pressed against the trees, its wide, hollow eyes locked onto mine. The pale skin stretched inhumanly tight over its features, its mouth split open into that grotesque grin. My stomach lurched. I wanted to scream. I needed to scream, but the terror stole my voice, leaving me a mute witness to this nightmare. I backed up a step, then another, but no matter where I moved, the face stayed there, always watching, always waiting. "Come back," it whispered again, its voice sounding so sweet, so inviting, like a lover's caress, or worse, a siren's call. I had heard that voice before, in my dreams, in my waking moments, in every shadowed corner of my mind. It was the voice of something ancient, something beyond human comprehension. But the worst part, the most horrifying part, was that it knew me. It knew my name. It knew everything. "Let me in," the voice coaxed, this time with a hint of something darker beneath it, something angrier. I took another step back, my pulse in my throat, my breath shallow and ragged. I had to escape. I had to leave this place behind. There was no other choice. But as I turned, a horrible realization hit me. The path was gone. The clearing, the trees, everything had shifted. I couldn't see the camp anymore. The world around me had folded in on itself, and all that remained was the darkness. "You can't leave," the voice whispered again, this time cold, sharp like steel. "You're already mine." I whirled around, expecting to see the face still there, still waiting for me, but now it was different. The figure had moved, no longer lurking behind the trees. It was standing directly in front of me, its long, thin limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Its skin stretched even tighter now, as though the bones beneath it were too large for its body. The face was now just inches away, a twisted, pale mask staring at me with those void-like eyes, wide open and gleaming with hunger. And its smile, it was too wide, too impossibly wide, splitting the skin into a grotesque, toothless grin. I screamed. It was a sound that came from deep within my chest, raw and primal, but it was swallowed by the forest. The trees seemed to close in on me, suffocating me, and the figure stepped forward. "Let me in," it said, its voice suddenly right next to my ear. "We're the same now." In that moment, I realized the horrible truth. It was me. I had been the one who had been following it all along. This thing, this creature, was no different than me. It was a reflection of my own fear, my own darkness. I stumbled backward, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. I couldn't look away. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I saw it for what it truly was, an echo of myself, a twisted reflection of everything I had ever been and feared. "No!" I gasped, the words barely forming as my chest tightened. "You're not me." But the figure just smiled wider, tilting its head in mock sympathy. "You are me. You have always been." And then it did something I couldn't have predicted. It reached up, placing its long, pale fingers on my face. The cold touch sent a shock wave through my body, and I felt my skin tighten, my body go rigid as it pressed its fingers into my flesh. I tried to scream, but the scream caught in my throat as though something had blocked my air. A pressure built in my chest, crushing me, suffocating me. And then, like a bolt of lightning, the world went dark. I woke up hours later in the same clearing, the same forest. But everything had changed. The trees were silent. The air was still. The world was waiting. I staggered to my feet, every movement slow, as if the forest was holding me back. My legs were weak, trembling beneath me. And then, as I turned, I saw it. The tent. My tent. The one I had pitched earlier with my friends. The one that I had been trying to return to. But there was something wrong with it now. It was no longer just a simple tent. The fabric seemed to sag, as if weighed down by an invisible force. The door flaps were open, and inside, the darkness seemed to pulse, as if something was moving, something alive. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if I wanted to know. As I neared the entrance, the voice came again. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, forceful, and unmistakable. Let me in. And then I saw it, no longer just a face in the forest. No longer just a haunting presence, but a figure standing in the doorway of the tent, waiting for me to come closer. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and its smile stretched even wider than before. I knew then that it wasn't asking anymore. It was telling me what I had to do, and I realized, in that sickening moment of clarity, that there was only one way this would end. The face wasn't outside the tent anymore. It was inside, and it was waiting,